This is a place where people would leave their gas stoves on 24/7 because it was cheaper than using the matches to relight the fire. Central Asia has always been super interesting to me as a person and as an overlooked part of the world, but Turkmenistan in particular, it's a unique place. How bizarre its government has been while simultaneously being unheard of in many places around the world. Today we ask, is Turkmenistan the North Korea of Central Asia? Let's get into it. Just an example of the weirdness of Turkmenistan. This is the Darvaza gas crater in Turkmenistan, made by a man-made abyss that the Soviets in their quest for oil accidentally opened up in the desert part of the country. And it results from a gas leak at the center of the crater that, since 1971, has never been extinguished. It is constantly engulfed in flames without ever extinguishing, even for a single day. This is just one of the weird stories indicative of the larger story of Turkmenistan. Turkmenistan is a mix of contrast, of beauty and mess. And this is what you can find online when you search for Turkmenistan. Turkmenistan is one of the most remote and inaccessible lands in the world. It's forgotten as a nation, not to mention its history. Let me explain to you how we got here. It's history time. Turkmenistan's isolation needs to be seen in its geographical and geopolitical context. The country is bordered to the south by Iran and Afghanistan to the north, west by the Caspian Sea. While the south hosts mountain ranges that form a natural border with Afghanistan, resources in Central Asia's, Turkmenistan's river valleys have sustained its civilization since ancient times. Although the region was dominated for many centuries by Turkmen tribes, Turkmenistan as a political entity only emerged in the last century, during the Soviet period, you could say. Think about it like that. The country was an underdeveloped socialist republic for the Soviets. Turkmenistan served as a supplier of raw materials, starting from its raw cotton fiber and oil and natural gas. Its main resources were puppets for that part of the world. Then, fast forward, environmental disasters, the drying of Lake Aral, among other things, helped to fuel disagreements among Central Asian nations over the consumption of raw, natural resources and waterways. And then the end of the subsidies when it came to the fall of the Soviet Union left the country in a precarious place, leading to the country's independence in 1991, and pretty much everything non-related with the gas industry went bankrupt at that time. Unemployment arose to the highest in the world, more than 60% in Turkmenistan. This led the country to export its gas at competitive prices in order to face the hegemony of Russia in the area once independent Turkmenistan began celebrating a policy of neutrality. They even put up a monument that was a symbol of such neutrality of theirs. The Ashgabat Tower was also created to attract the attention of foreign investors in Turkmenistan. After all, they needed money, because that's basically what everyone needs. It wanted to revitalize its industry, in particular its gas industry, and establish an emeritus state, just like Kuwait did previous. With approximately 2.7 trillion cubic meters of natural gas reserves, Turkmenistan was in fact the second largest producer in the formed Soviet Union and is currently the 9th largest producer globally. This size and a share of Turkmenistan could let Turkmenistan achieve incredible economic development. This is, however, in an ideal world. Independence was never sought in Turkmenistan before, and it was never eager to implement serious reforms. For example, independence was never sought in Turkmenistan as it was never eager to implement serious reforms. That would lead to things, for example, like the liberalization of prices, allowing a real private market sector to emerge, and less control in its economy. Despite some improvements in recent years, a large part of the population still lives below the poverty line, and the income is fragile and stagnant, contrary to the claims of the country's former president for life. Speaking of the president, the so-called Turkmen-belching, a title which means literally father of all Turkmen, according to the president's annual reports, the national growth rate was a massive 20% as of August 2006. Think about that. Just for comparison, China's growth rate today has only been able to average a high of 9% for the last 30 years. 9% is a historic growth rate. 20%, therefore, is highly suspect, let's say that. Then after this, you should know that the president died of a heart attack. Later, according to others, he was poisoned. Some accuse him of being a megalomaniac dictator, a liar, who leveraged national symbolism. In 2002, in the capital Ashgabat, a massive new statue of the Book was raised, representing a new era, they said, according to those in power. Miyazov, who ruled Turkmenistan as a dictator from 1985 until his death in 2006, argued that the Turkmenistan nation development began more than 5,000 years ago, and he said now that Turkmenistan can live separate and isolated from other states while maintaining its traditions and customs. This was the turning point for Turkmenistan. But then it began to look even more like North Korea than Russia. In every place, the words and the most striking quotations of the glorious leader, as he was called, were inscribed on walls, on plates, on billboards. A series of great public monuments exalted its virtues in cities, dams, roads, libraries, and schools. In fact, one of the hallmarks of the regime, much more than in other neighboring countries, before becoming known as Turkmenbashi. Then it was kind of interesting, yet as the Union seemed to unravel, they switched the political flags, shift surprisingly quickly in favor of Turkmen nationalism. There was a case in point when at the end of the last formal meeting of the party after lunch, they gathered the same members in the same hall to fund the Democratic Party of Turkmenistan. And here's where it gets interesting. Many would say the spiritual father of the faceless country, the faceless gray men and anonymous local party bureaucrats, and staunch supporter of the Soviet ideology in Turkmenistan was Niyazov. Yet, as the Union unraveled, Niyazov switched those political flags himself. How was it that Niyazov, a single man, was able to take control after lunch of the Turkmenistan almost by himself? It all comes back to natural gas. By extracting and shipping gas through the pipelines to Russia, the country earned meager revenues from the sale of its primary commodity. And years of exploited denationalization of gas and took control of all the industrial plants, but sadly for the population, the brokerage companies operated on his behalf. By that we mean he commercialized Turkmen gas and channeled the revenues into the president's bank account revenues. And that served as his main source of income to give the semblance of general economic improvements. In short, Turkmenbashi undertook a series of daring state projects. And this was done to consolidate its consensus among a population, and it all kind of worked for him because the capital city, for instance, had went from an underdeveloped village to become a showcase for foreign investors, made of majestic public buildings and white marble, now famous in the land. It turned into a sumptuous set of parks and white streets, which are still beautiful today. Previously, almost empty water scarcity was a daily issue, and yet more than 1,000 fountains were built in glittering facades of public buildings. Wowzers. Zooming out a little bit, still Turkmenistan remained a country marked by isolation, poverty, and a systemic suppression of freedom of speech. The only real applicable law at the time was that of Niyazov himself, who, besides controlling the information and media, deprived courts and parliament institutions of their power, years justifying the absence of pro-democratic reforms due to what he called the Turkmen mentality. Niyazov has banned everything that was not part of the Turkmen culture. These include video games, cars, radios, and opera, long hair and beards for men, and last but not least, dogs, because, according to him, when walking down the streets of the capital, dogs gave off a bad smell. It's much easier to keep control over an ignorant and uneducated population, especially when the mass media and even the police force were corrupted with bribes, as stated by a journalist who fled the country for the past 12 years. Turkmenbashi plunged the country into neo-Stalinism as a nightmare, although the country had adopted shortly after independence a constitution conforming to international standards. It didn't. The country's father is a defender, but also his attacks go out to anyone who questioned the country's progress. Attacks in return were then condemned as accusations made by supporters of foreign powers, whether it be an American, Russian, or European. But he repeatedly said that Turkmenistan was free of crimes of any kind, and that no rights had been violated in the country. As an example of this, November 2002, following an assassination attempt against him, the president seized the opportunity to cast suspicion on some ministers who were openly against him, including the ex-foreign minister. By the time Niyazov passed away, the country was in a pitiful state, with the economy completely paralyzed, lacking internal and external investments, with a gas and oil route at stake between Russia and China. With no monetary aid either from the big international funds or from domestic bank insurances with the new president, there's been very small change of direction. An average Turkmen doesn't make more than $20 per month still. Speaking of cost and people, are you into unique destinations and projects? Check out abandoned mega project Miami Marine Stadium that refuses to be torn down despite being abandoned for over 3 decades. Check out the video on your screen right now or hit up the channel link in the description. Make sure you've subscribed to Around the Amazing World for more updates and mega projects.